I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. I have some stories to tell. By Search and Rescue Woods. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that you guys might be interested in. Now, I guess I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of them either wander off a path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. A majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't quite happen. And both kind of bother me a lot. I use them both as motivation to search even harder on the next missing person case I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. The parents lost sight of him just for a few seconds, and in that time, both kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find him, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly. When asked where her brother was, she said that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man, and he seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found any trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls we've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other one was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed a tree to get a better view of the forest, but she never came back down. They waited at the base of that tree for hours, calling her name before they called us for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a single trace of her. I have no idea where she possibly could have gone, because neither her mother or her grandpa saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with 0 possible handholds. It's always baffling. And in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's got to be an explanation. But it's sort of strange, isn't it? One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into an ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and that part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She just couldn't live with the loss of her daughter, I guess. For this one, I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we had received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get where we figured he would be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant, to say the least. He had been there for almost 2 days, and the leg was obviously seriously infected. We were able to get him to a chopper, and we heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He was talking about how he'd been doing just fine, and that when he had gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment or anything, He was just wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said that he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. To be honest, I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things to ever happen to me involved the search for a young woman who had gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late that night, because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotten log. She was missing her shoes and pack. She was clearly in shock, but she didn't have any injuries. We were able to get her to walk back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us, asking why that man with the big black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock, right? But the closer we got to base, the more agitated the woman got. She kept asking us to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started just yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her back to moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. I guess you could say it was insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of the base ops, the woman turned to me, her eyes about as wide as I can imagine a human could possibly open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He tells me to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at that scar on your neck." I have a very, very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman could have saw it. Right after she said that, I heard that weird cough right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. We hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was. But I have to say, I was really happy when we left that area that night. This is the last one I'll tell for now, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken thing. A regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably most likely won't say anything. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all kind of gotten used to it to where it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we are really far off in the wilderness, I'm talking like 30 or 40 miles out, at some point, we will find a staircase right in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs out of your house, cut and pasted them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw one, and another officer told me not to worry about it, that it was just normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing, and I wanted to go check them out, but I was told, very empathetically, that I should never, ever go near any of them. So I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I do have a lot more stories, so I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell you some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs or anyone who's seen them, let me know. So I logged back on tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There has been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between my stories and those of David Paulites. I assure you that I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the guy. He's actually what inspired me to write these down. because I can verify a lot of the stuff he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing person cases, and most of the time they aren't solved. Either that, or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few I've seen and a story my friend told me that relates to this. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins. Others are brand spanking new. I saw one set that looked like it came out of a lighthouse. They were spiral and metal, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely, or farther than anyone can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try to get them after the first time. I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the other climber ascended the top and reached the peak, he saw another man in parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Alright, on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say half the calls I get are related to that. The other rescue calls, people who fall off cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by a fire, you wouldn't believe how often this happens. Mostly to stupid drunk kids. Or getting bit or stung by an animal or an insect. We're a tight team. We have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes the cases where we find no trace of them so frustrating. One particular one was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than it did answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a pretty well-established trail. His wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and suffered one out on the trail. Now, before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. But I don't ask about that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Someone's missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found sign that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering just about as much ground as we possibly could. Suddenly, a call comes out over the radio telling us to head back to the vet's location. And of course, we come right away because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need a full team to get him back to safety. Once we meet back up, the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points up to one of the branches in the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 or so feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle had been looped around a branch, and it was just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious that no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring the canines out, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is just called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to. Past a certain point, there's just nothing we can do. The guy's wife calls us every day for months, asking if we found her husband. And, it was heartbreaking hearing her get more and more hopeless at each call. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it's just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell did the guy's cane end up in the tree? Did someone kill him and toss it up there as some sort of weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids, that's the most heartbreaking. It doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under. It's never easy. And we always dread the ones that we find deceased. Now, it's not common, but it does happen. David Polites talks about a lot of kids in the SAR teams find in places they shouldn't be. Or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it. But I'll share one of the ones I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area at the side of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, the other is about 3. She is watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never let any of them out of her sight for any amount of time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs up their stuff and starts to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost from getting there to the parking lot, unless you're deliberately going off the path like some kind of imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her, when she hears a sound. It sounds like someone's coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she wasn't looking, her 5-year-old son just vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something. She asks the other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and then led him off into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They were sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course, naturally, she freaks out and starts looking frantically in the area for the kid. She is screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got 2 other kids right there. So she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond and we start to search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. The canines can't pick up a scent. We can't find any clothing or broken bushes, literally anything that would signify a child being in the area. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she is just completely destroyed by the whole thing. We look for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help too. But eventually, the search kind of peters out, and we do have to move on. The volunteers do keep searching though. One day we get a call on the radio, letting us know that a body needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there anyway. About 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid that we had been looking for. I've been trying to figure out how this kid got to where he did ever since we found him, and I've never came up with a good answer. A volunteer just happened to be in that area. He figured he might as well look at places that no one else would think to look, on the off chance that the body was dumped. He comes across the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up he sees something. He looks through binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed into one of the little openings in a rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in. And we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get the body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he started, but there's no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope is treacherous. It's hard even for us with all of our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way in hell of getting up there. Of that, I am just absolutely certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what I can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by this point, and it looked like he'd almost been dead for, at most, a day, maybe 2. The whole thing was just unbelievably strange. And this was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined that the kid died from exposure. He froze to death. Probably late at night, 2 days before anyone found him. There are no suspects and no answers. To date, this is probably one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs had such a strong scent and trail, and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about a half a mile where he had been seen last. The kid wasn't even aware that he had wandered off that far. One of our vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm really not that good with kids. And, I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me where one of the hot spots are, where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people usually move downhill because it's easier. So we hike out there. It's a few miles away, and we get back in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, she's pointing out places where people are found in the past, and I see something off in the distance. Now, listen, this area is about 8 miles from the main parking area, but there are some back roads you can take to get closer if you don't feel like hiking that far. But we're on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out there. The most you'll see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with. But I can see from where we are that whatever this thing is, it has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn pretty quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed out, but she doesn't do anything. She just kind of hangs back and let me wander over to check it out. I got within about 20 feet of it, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. It's a staircase in the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of it being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see what it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the houses fail to load in completely, and the stairs are the only thing that's visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there, casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the fuck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckles and says, "Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them." I start to move closer and she grabs my arm. Hard. "I wouldn't do that," she said. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight, and I just stand there looking at her. "You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them." I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, within a mile or 2 or 3. Sometimes they're 20, 30, 50 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them on the broadest of searches, or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for years. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion, and they were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. Don't go close. Don't go up them. Now, when my trainees ask about it, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in the winter, when realistically no one should be that far out on the trails. We close a lot of trails, but some remain open all year round, unless there's just a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy amount for snow that year. And we knew that it wasn't likely that we would find him until spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw was there, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. Right away we knew what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or who spend any time on a mountain would probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees, because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of the tree that's a filled mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. We call them tree wells. They're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are, but every year we get an unusual amount of snow. At least one person just doesn't read them, or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we found out about it in the spring. My best guess was that this young man was hiking and he got tired or maybe a cramp, and he went to go sit at the base of a tree, not knowing there was a tree well, and he just fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding area of snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really, really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be fatal. What scared me was just imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out of. As it got harder to breathe, he must have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing. But then again, I didn't see anything. However, there was this one call where I had something kind of similar happen. But I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the Goat Man. We had gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs, to us and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife just starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her and she's just passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and we were able to get her down to the welcome center. She comes to and just starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember what she said verbatim, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she was hearing this really strange noise. It sounded like sort of a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't figure out why. She went a little way ahead to try to hear it better, and it sounded like something was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy that she was, until finally she figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part, because it was so weird, I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man, saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it, and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting meow meow at people. So once we had gone down the mountain, I told my superior I'm going to search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she was. I don't see anyone. So I keep going about a mile more, and when I go back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It was almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out here alone at night. So I sort of just write it off and make a mental note to check out the area again tomorrow. But as I'm headed back, I hear something in the distance. I stop and I call out to anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. But the sound didn't come closer or louder. But it did sound exactly like a man saying, meow, meow, in this really odd monotone. As comical as it sounded, it was almost what that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get any closer. It's almost like it's coming from all the directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I end up just going back to the welcome center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been just some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit, it was weird. So, this kind of turned into a massive wall of text. I apologize. I wanted to get the stories that my friend told me, and he does have some good ones. So, I'll post those tomorrow evening. I also have a few more of my own I think you guys will like. I'm so sorry to keep you in suspense again, but hopefully these stories here make up for it, and you can get through the next 24 hours until I can post again. Edit. Since all of you seem to like and would like to hear more, I'll write up as many stories as I can and do a massive post tomorrow. I'll include my friend's stories, and I'll see if I can't get a hold of a few people who might have interesting things to talk about. I wasn't sure how people felt about big, giant walls of text, but if you're all okay with it, I'll post lots of stories. Well, once again, you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to these stories. There's no way I can respond to each one of you individually, so I'm just going to address more common things again, then move on with the stories. I'm gonna write as many as I can think of, in addition to my friend's stories. I'll probably not update this again until I get a chance to answer some questions that I have for my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found that you all had. I am not comfortable exactly talking about where I work. Unfortunately, in all reality, some things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble, or fired. So it's best that I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I am in the United States, and I'm in an area that's comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest, with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs. And luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think all of you will be very interested in. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I thought of asking my superiors about them, I have, but again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works for the SAR office, and it's possible that he may be willing to talk to me about it. I'll be speaking to him later on in the week, and I'll let you know how that turns out. As far as advice on becoming an SAR officer goes, I think the best advice I can give is go to your local Forest Service office and see if they offer training courses, or what the qualifications are. I've been doing this for years, but I started out as a volunteer helping on SAR operations. It's a great job despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, let's move on to the stories. This first happened on a case that I went out on right after going out into training. I was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I kind of had a basic idea of what to expect, but on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As an SAR officer, you go out on all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called early in the morning from a young couple who were out on the trails that go by a lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we get there, we see him holding his wife, and she had something in her arms. She was screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he was sobbing. When he sees us, he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there now. Now, obviously, we can't drive an ambulance up the walking path, so we ask him if his wife needs help or if she can walk down on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife who needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking and holding something, just shrieking over and over. I crouch down to see whatever it is that she's holding. It's covered in blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front and my heart sinks. I ask her what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms open gently so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby, obviously dead. His head was caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation just hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself, and I get up and go get one of the other vets who was standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of just pats my shoulder and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see the kid. By the time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us that we can't have him. That he'll be okay if we just leave her alone to help him. But eventually, one of the vets managed to calm her down and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMTs showed up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from trauma to the head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital. She told me later what had happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. The dad takes the kid and is holding him, looking over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil, and she trips, falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling down a hill about 20 feet into this gully onto the rocks on the bottom. The dad climbed down to recover the kid, but he had fallen on his head. He was dead by the time the dad got down there. The baby was only about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, and a series of events that coalesced into the worst possible outcome. That's probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as an SAR officer, mostly because there aren't that many animals that come in the area. While there are bears, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see around here are small ones, like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose. And let me tell you, moose are some nasty fuckers. They'll chase after anything for any reason. And God help you if you get between a female moose and its baby. One of the more amusing calls I was on was a guy who had been chased down by an absolutely massive male moose, and the guy was stuck in a tree. It took us almost an hour to get him down, and when he finally got on solid ground again, he looks at me and says, "God damn, them fuckers are big up close." I guess it's not really a scary story, but we still laugh at that one. I honestly don't know how I had forgotten about this story, but this is by far the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time in the woods, you don't ever want to get yourself scared of being alone, or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this, you tend to forget all about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me seriously consider if this was the right job for me. I don't really like thinking about it too much, but I'll do the best I can to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent, and they told us what most parents do. "My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before." We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and we spread out in a standard search formation. I was partnered with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually walking as we hiked. I know it sounds callous, but you sort of become desensitized when you've done this as long as we have. It becomes the norm. And I think to a certain extent, you kind of have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to get the job done right. We were searching for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where she could have been, and we came out of a small valley when something made us both stop in unison. We froze and looked at each other, and there's almost like this sensation, like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop and I have this odd feeling, This odd feeling of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest noise ever. And I mean the loudest noise I've ever heard in my entire life. It's almost like a freight train was passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below. He screamed something at me, but I couldn't hear him over this deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we looked all around us trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us sees anything. Of course, my first thought was a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs. And even if we were, it definitely would have hit us by now. The sound goes on and on and on, and we're trying to yell at each other, but even standing close together, we couldn't hear anything but this sound. Then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stood there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the normal sounds of the woods come back. He asked me what the fuck just happened, and I just kind of shrug. We stand there looking at each other for a minute. I get on the radio and ask if anyone heard the end of the fucking world, but no one else heard it, even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I just sort of shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we all check on the radios. No one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark, but because we don't have any lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together, and we're calling out for her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope that we find her, because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being out here all alone in the dark is awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daylight. At night, well, it's a whole different beast. But we're not seeing any signs of her or getting any responses. And around midnight, we decide to turn back and head towards the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines the light to our right, into a really thick deadfall, or a group of dead trees. I asked him if he heard a response, but he just told me to be quiet for a second and listen. I do, and in the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both call the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's really faint crying. We headed in the direction of this deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start to get this weird feeling in my gut, and I tell my buddy that something definitely isn't right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again, and at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying is on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, wait, then a quiet hiccup, repeated over and over, exactly the same way, every time. And without saying another word, we both just take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong, and neither one of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous point, we asked if anyone else heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know this sounds kind of anticlimactic, but that call had me fucked up for a long time. As for the little girl, we never found any trace of her. We keep an eye out for her, and all the other people who we've never found a body from. But frankly, I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the missing persons calls I've been put on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person, nothing. But sometimes, finding a body leads to more questions than it does answers. Here's some of the bodies that we found that have become infamous on our team. A teenage boy whose remains were discovered almost a half a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera, almost 40 miles from where he had been seen. The camera, sadly, was destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who vanished a month earlier. That was all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of the ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome, almost 20 miles from where she vanished. She had died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. There were berries and cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. The coroner said it appears as if someone was taking care of her. There were no suspects ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby, found a week after vanishing, in the trunk of a hollow tree 10 miles from the area where he was last seen. There was fresh milk in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and a right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl, found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground where her parents had been that previous summer. Now, onto a couple stories that my friend told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and you're in luck. He's had a closer encounter with them than I have, though he doesn't have any more explanation for them, but he does have a bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy has been an SAR officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the exact same thing mine did, which is never go near, touch, or ascend them. For the first year, he did just that, but apparently his curiosity got the better of him. On one call, he broke away from the line and went to go check out a set. He said that they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished. The dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house, because the carpeting was pristine and white. He said the closer he got, he didn't feel any different or hear any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The only thing he said was odd was that there was absolutely no debris on the steps. No dirt, leaves, dust, nothing. And that there didn't appear to be any signs of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which he also found strange. It was less like things were avoiding them, and more like they just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and he didn't feel anything, except that sort of sticky feeling you get from new carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said it was terrifying because of the way they had been stigmatized. He wasn't really sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported into some other dimension, and the other half was watching for a UFO to come swooping down. But he got to the top with little event. He just stood there, looking around. But he said the longer he stood at the top step, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as if it was the feeling you get when you were in a part of a government building you weren't supposed to be in. As if someone was gonna come arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger. And that's when he realized he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest were gone. He couldn't hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but way more oppressive. He climbed back down and rejoined the search. No mention of what he had done. But he said the weirdest part came after. His trainer was waiting for him back at the welcome center after the search ended for the day. He was cornered by my buddy before he could leave. He He said the trainer had this intense look of anger, and he asked what was wrong. "You went up them, didn't you?" My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how the trainer knew. The trainer just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost her scent." My buddy asked what it had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he had been on the stairs, and my buddy said no more than a minute. And his trainer gave him this really awful dead-eyed look. And he told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs again, he would be fired immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he never answered the question that my buddy asked him about it. My buddy's been involved in a lot of missing person cases where there's never been a trace found. I mentioned David Polite's, and my buddy said that he can confirm that those stories, for the most part, are accurate. He said that most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found, or they're found weeks, months, or even years later, in places that they couldn't possibly have gotten into. One story he told me really stood out. It involved a 5-year-old boy with severe mental disability. The little boy vanished from a picnic area late in the fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped. His parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone had to have taken him. My buddy said they searched for the kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range. But it was like the kid had never been there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere, not even in the picnic area where he had vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their own kid. The search was concluded about a month later, and my buddy said that everyone had pretty much forgotten about it by the winter. He was out on a training op in the snow in one of the higher peaks. He came across something in the snow. He said he saw it from far away at first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking partway out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kid, because it had a very distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, lying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been dead for more than a few days, but he'd been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something. When my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was, he said he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He said that it was a big chunk of ice that had been carved crudely to sort of look like a person, and the kid was holding it so tight that it had frostbitten his chest and hands. My buddy could tell, even with the decay, that had taken place. He radioed in the rest of the crew, and they took the body off the mountain. Now, he recapped all of this for me, and put it simply that there was no way the kid had survived out there for 3 months on his own, or gotten to this peak. There was no physical way the child could have walked almost 50 miles and ended up on the top of a goddamn mountain. And to top it all off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing. Not even water. It was like my buddy said. The kid had been taken off the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and then dropped down the mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He never really got over that one. The last story I'll share from him took place relatively recently, only a couple of months ago. They were out doing recon for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout out areas where these animals are seen, to ensure that if they are in the area, we can warn people and close off those trails. He was out in one of the very heavily forested part, towards dusk, when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming off in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, It sounds exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back to let ops know that he had heard one, and that he was going to keep going to see if he can figure out where its territory was. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determined the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time within only a few yards of him. Of course, he freaks out and starts heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wanted to do was run into a goddamn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the path and started heading back, the screaming followed him, so he broke into a jog. He was about a mile from ops. The screaming stopped. He turned around to see if it was following him. It was almost night at this point, but he said in the distance, just before the path rounded a corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the path was closed, and that he needed to come back to the welcome center. The figure just stood there. My buddy started to walk over, and when he was about 10 yards away, he said the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step toward him and let out the scream that my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to ops, never looking behind him. By the time he got back, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone else, just said that there was a mountain lion in the area and that they needed to close those paths until it could be caught and moved. I'm going to end this entry here, since it turned into another huge wall of text. But I'm going to be heading out on a yearly training out tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. I'll be meeting a lot of former trainers and buddies who work in the areas of the park, and I'll be asking about any stories they'd like to share. I am really so glad you guys have been interested in these stories, and once I'm back from this op, I'll continue to share them. I'd like to thank my $10 and above patrons in order that they pledged: Paul Z, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, Chaos X, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, and a new one, Dan R. Thank you guys so much. You make this content possible. And if you would like access to some Patreon-only content, and for me to read your name off at the end of the video and a thank you, go over to Patreon down below and join at the $10 tier. You get access to the content at $5, but you know you want me to read your name off. Of course you do. All jokes aside, thank you guys so much for your support. I will have this next part up next week.